Are built-up urban areas ecological deserts?
Yeah, so this is a common misconception. People tend to think of nature and biodiversity, animals and plants as things that happen outside of the city. That once you get into a city, it's all concrete roads and houses and things. And that is a misconception, because there's all kinds of interesting animals and plants in cities. One of the things we need to remember, of course, is that outside of cities, you've got agricultural land, you've got all kinds of villages strung out through the landscape in the UK. So once you're outside of the city, humans have had a huge impact anyway. And actually, within our cities, we sometimes pay much closer attention to the ecosystem. So there's all kinds of species that can persist despite the fact that we've built all these houses and roads. And often that's really quite interesting from a biological perspective to study why animals are able to persist and how they manage it.
So where in cities would you go to find urban wildlife?
So this is an increasingly interesting question in biology. Traditionally, of course, when you think about urban wildlife, you're thinking about parks. So people would go to the park and there might be trees and there'd be grass, and people think that this green space in cities is a good place to find wildlife. The problem is that the way that we manage this green space means that we mow all the grass down so it's nice and clean, and we weed our borders so that all the plants, if they're there, are very tightly managed. And what that means is that actually we have relatively little biodiversity in these green spaces. What we've discovered over the last 10 or 20 years, I suppose, is that if we look in places that aren't necessarily managed, we tend to find a lot more. So things like old industrial sites, we call them brownfield sites, where there might have been a factory, say, on a site, and then it's just been left. It's been left to rack and ruin, but nature moves in, and you see all kinds of interesting things where nature is allowed to run wild. So these brownfield sites can be really quite valuable for biodiversity.
So could you tell us a bit about the Bradford Becks?
Yeah, so this is a project that I'm taking an interest in at the moment. There's some wonderful work being done by the Friends of Bradford's Becks. For those of you who aren't familiar with Bradford's Becks, this is a network of streams that runs through Bradford and sometimes underneath Bradford. So some of the streams, some time ago, century ago now, were covered. They were what we call culverted. So they were channeled into these concrete cylinders, and they still roughly follow the same paths that they used to, but now they're underneath roads. And obviously there's only so much wildlife that can persist in those sorts of streams when they're underground. So some of the streams, when you go a little bit out of Bradford, are really very nice, pleasant green streams. But now there's this move to try to do what's called daylighting. So daylighting is when we take a culverted stream, so one of these concrete channels, we break it open, so we break through the ceiling of the stream, and we open it up. We try to encourage it to be more natural, so we try to re-engineer the river so it meanders a little bit rather than being straight, and we try to clear up the problems that are inherent with that kind of highly artificial system. And this has become increasingly important because we have these targets to meet under the EU Water Framework Directive. So this is a big piece of EU legislation that says that all of our streams and rivers have to be in good ecological condition. And I'll tell you one thing, those streams that are in the concrete channels are not in good ecological condition.
Okay, so, are urban ponds and streams and lakes different to those in the country, and to what extent are they naturally different?
Yeah, so this is an area in which I'm actively researching now. So I have a PhD student who's working on urban freshwater biodiversity. So there's lots of really interesting things about the way that we treat freshwaters in cities. Freshwaters have always been the sink for human activity. So whenever we're finished with something, we throw it into the nearest stream and it washes away and we forget about it. And ponds are the same, really. We tend to use them for a lot of things, none of which tend to be biodiversity. So within cities, you might have stormwater management ponds, so they control floodwater. You might have things like, you might have nature reserves, which are good for biodiversity, but you might also have these garden lakes, these park lakes. And as I was talking about before, when we go into an area and we landscape an area and we mow all the grass and make it nice and clean, we tend to also make it sterile. So these lakes that can look very nice, very pretty, with their concrete edge and the fountain in the middle, they might have really almost no biodiversity in them whatsoever. So some ponds are they're very diverse in cities, certainly, ponds and streams, and a lot of that really is generated from the purpose to which people put them. But the thing we keep finding time and time again is that nature finds a way. So the fact that we've got this wide diversity of different uses means we have a diversity of different pond types, and that means we have a diversity of ecological communities living within them.
So presumably, if we go to the large fountains in Trafalgar Square, there wouldn't really be any life in them at all.
That's not where I would look for biodiversity. Although I will say before we move on, fountains are really interesting from a microbial perspective. So what you have there, of course, is you have the rocky or marble or whatever it is that's constantly wetted by the fountain. And when you look at the lichens and the mosses and the microbes that cling to the rock, you can have some really fascinating ecology going on there. People wouldn't notice it, but it is there.
The reason I mentioned Trafalgar Square is because I certainly remember when I was young, Trafalgar Square was colonised by town pigeons. And I was wondering, why do pigeons thrive so much in cities?
Yeah, so pigeons obviously are the aspect of biodiversity that people always associate with cities. And there's a couple of reasons. So the first is that they are what's called pre-adapted for urban life. So their natural habitat is nesting on cliffs and other rocky, near vertical surfaces. Now, what people did was we moved into otherwise flat land and built all these buildings, which really are very close to the sort of rocky cliffs that the rock doves, the wild rock doves, as pigeons used to be, evolved to occupy. So what we've done is we've moved into flat land and we've built cliffs, and the pigeons love it. They're also very good at breeding when the times are good and foraging for food far and wide. So they've become an extremely effective example of what's called a synanthropic species, which means that they benefit from human activity.
So are town pigeons a different species to their predecessors, or are they just slightly different in their nature?
So yeah, there's a couple of different types of species. The town pigeons that you see, there's what we call feral pigeons, and then there's stock doves as well. So these are all broadly the same species. Probably there might be some subspecies floating around in there as well. They're all related, and they've all been mixed and separated, and then mixed back together at different times, which means that the genetics is quite complicated.
So why are wood pigeons a less common sight in cities?
Yeah, so the standard pigeon that you come across all the time is your feral pigeon, or your stock dove, if you like. So these are what you'll find pecking around Trafalgar Square. They're very good at pecking up whatever falls their way, so it might be tourists feeding them bread. Wood pigeons, on the other hand, have slightly more specific habitat requirements. So, as the name suggests, they prefer woods, they prefer woodland. They do very well in agricultural fields outside of cities, so you're less likely to see them in the cities. But also they're what we call granivores, so they eat seeds off the floor. This is why farmers will ask people to come onto their land just after they've sown a field, because that's when all the wood pigeons come down and hoover up all the seeds. So they're different niches. They need different things in their environment, which is why you don't see so many wood pigeons in cities.
So in cities we've also got birds of prey, but I mean, what kinds of birds of prey do we find, and are they self-sustainable in cities, or do they require human intervention to help them along?
Yeah, so this is another really interesting aspect of urban ecosystems. We've seen the re-emergence of top predators among the birds. So peregrine falcons, the fastest bird of prey, reaches, I think, something like 185 kilometers per hour when it dive bombs its prey from above. These things have performed extremely well in cities as well. There's a pair nesting around the University of Sheffield. There has been a pair around the centre of Leeds 5 or 10 years ago. I believe that there's a pair just off St Aidan's coal mine, which is now an RSPB reserve. They're doing extremely well in cities, and one of the reasons is that they need a similar habitat to the pigeons. So they like these high up ledges where they can lay their eggs. The pigeons themselves provide them with a more than ample food supply, and the peregrine falcons really have been doing extremely well. Another pair that's risen to prominence recently is a pair that interrupted work on York Minster. So they have nested reasonably recently, and it looks like they may have produced their first egg up there as well. So we may have a breeding population of peregrine falcons on York Minster controlling the pigeons of York.
Wow, that's quite outstanding. So we actually got birds of prey that are kind of reproducing and are starting their own ecosystems, really. Well, I wanted to ask you about foxes, because some people like them and some people don't. Are the bolder foxes that we find in towns different to those in the countryside?
Yeah, so foxes obviously are the other animal that people see around, perhaps rummaging through their bins. There's no real evidence that the foxes in the cities are any different to the foxes in the countryside, genetically at least. So they're the same populations. Really what we see is suburban foxes, so you don't see foxes often roaming through the middle of a city. They might wander through, but they won't be nesting there. So the populations in the countryside and the populations in the suburbs will exchange, they'll move between the two. Rather than boldness per se, it's probably just that the foxes in the cities have become habituated to people. So it's not that there's something about them that makes them more willing to interact with people. It's that people feed them. They become used to people leaving food out for them. People get used to people's bins and see those as relatively safe places to forage. Certainly there's not so much persecution of foxes in the cities as there is in the countryside, for obvious reasons. We don't have any chickens to protect by and large in the cities, so we don't tend to worry about them so much. So the fox populations are the same, but they adapt behaviourally to urban life very well.
So it's not really possible that these foxes are evolving away from their ancestors. There's no kind of evolution taking place because there's too much mixing.
Yeah, that's right. And the mixture is what will stop them. So what you need for evolution is you need a separation between groups of individuals. Sometimes that's populations on two different islands, for example, some kind of barrier that stops individuals moving between the two populations. And then evolution usually takes hold and random evolution will occur. In the cities, obviously, there's a different set of evolutionary pressures. So these things that influence the way in which animals survive. So that theoretically could produce evolution. And we do see evolution in some species, but not in the foxes because they move too far.
So you previously did mention that we see foxes foraging in bins, and that's kind of seen as a bad thing in cities. So, in your opinion, do foxes damage overall or benefit in some way the urban environment?
I think they probably benefit us. I mean, they always say that you're never more than 6 feet from a rat, for example. And were we to get rid of all of our urban foxes, we'd almost certainly see a boom in our urban rat populations. The costs that foxes exert on urban ecosystems really are very minimal. They're a balancing force. And the only reason why they're so common is that we've removed all of the other predators. So we used to have wolves and bears and lynx and all these exciting animals, but now it's really just the fox that's left. So they're having to fulfill all kinds of different ecological, environmental roles as a predator to control all these other species, and I think they're probably doing a pretty good job.
Well, I'd like to ask, what are invasive species, and what are the problems that they bring to cities?
Yeah, so cities are hotbeds of invasive species. We tend to see the first place that an invasive species arrives in the UK will be a city. It'll be because somebody's ordered some plants for their pond, or somebody's ordered a pet that's come from an exotic place.
So, like the Japanese knotweed, for instance, is that?
Japanese knotweed. There's a couple of species which were not introduced into cities first. That was some ill-advised Victorian naturalists who brought them over and weren't quite so careful as they should have been with where they were planting them. But those are exceptions, really. A lot of the species that have moved over in the last couple of years have been the result of accidental or deliberate introductions by people who are naive to the risks of invasive species.
So, such as grey squirrels, for instance?
I don't know much about the history of grey squirrel introductions, but they certainly could have been brought over deliberately as possible. Obviously, the native red species is suffering as a result.
You mentioned rats, and I wanted to ask if rats were an invasive species, because were they successful before we built the cities? Do they simply rely on cities for their existence?
They don't rely necessarily. I think they would be reasonably successful regardless. So rats and a lot of other species, these small mammals, including things like rabbits, for example, and cats, they all breed extremely quickly, and they all have varying degrees of dietary needs, so they can adapt their diet to a certain extent. So what we tend to see is that the rats breed very quickly. They can produce enormous numbers of themselves over a short period of time, and that allows them to exploit a wide range of environments. The fact is that we have produced huge piles of food rotting in the streets and in our bins and on landfills in the middle of the city, and that's an ideal sort of habitat for the rats. They can take advantage of sudden pulses of food like that that are very closely, they're very aggregated in space, so they're piles in particular locations. That's where the rats come into their own, really.
So are they as dangerous to human health as we kind of think they are? There's kind of all these scaremongering stories that we've got, I don't know, 6 rats for every human being in cities. Are these stories really, is there anything to be worried about with these stories?
Rats do pose a health problem. I don't think there's any denying that. They move dirt around, and pathogens, diseases around. There are some diseases that are specifically linked to rats, for example. As to whether or not they're a serious threat, I don't think in the UK they are, really, by and large. I think we have sufficient levels of sanitation that we manage to suppress any of the problems that are associated with the rats. Of course, there are going to be a lot of cities around the world that really struggle, those areas without such developed infrastructure. But by and large in the UK, it's not much of an issue. There are always things we can do better, though.
So we've talked about rats as invasive species. What about cats?
So cats are one of my favourite little bugbears. I get asked to provide media comments from time to time, and the only comment that I've ever made that solicited hate mail was on cats. So cats are a major problem in cities. Often you'll find that you'll find them roaming around quite far from their homes. They don't always just eat what they need. They'll do what's called wasteful killing, so they'll kill animals for the sake of it and leave the bodies or drag them around. Some of you might have been treated by the present of a half-eaten mouse in the morning that your cat's dragged in overnight. So the cats can be a real problem. They kill millions, possibly billions of small mammals, birds and reptiles every year. And because we have this strong cultural association with them, we seem reluctant to try to do anything about it. There are, however, some brilliant ways that you can mitigate the impacts that your cat has on the environment. So you can keep them inside. Some would say that's cruel, others would say that's responsible. What you can do is attach a bell so that birds and other animals hear the cat coming. Another great thing I've seen recently is that you can get these neon-coloured collars that you put around your cat. And what this means is that as the cat's creeping around and it's half camouflage and it's trying to sneak up on an animal, the animal can see it coming because it has this utterly absurd clown-like aura around it. Those cost a few pounds, and they'd be a great Christmas gift for any cat owner.